applied linguist. But if we look more specifically at the field of world English is, there's not much direct study directly related to communication that occurs in the classroom across different varieties of English. However, discourse, or what is broadly referred to as style in sociolinguistics, has been recognized as an important component of language systems, at least since Bill Hymes's work from the late 1960s and 1970s. This is, of course, in addition to the referential aspects of language, such as syntax, phonology, and lexicon, which are more often the focus of descriptions of varieties of English. Hymes and others since him have looked at norms of interaction and norms of interpretation as central to the way that people speak. Larry's work on discourse across cultures, of course, also is concerned with such considerations. Classrooms, and in particular, classrooms where the teacher and students do not share the same background or English discourse variety, represent a setting where stylistic differences often interact and conflict in interesting ways. In fact, we can say that classrooms represent a major setting, sometimes the only setting, in which many students of English in so-called expanding circle countries are likely to encounter such differences. So I would like now to briefly discuss two aspects of this interaction that I have found to be particularly interesting in the context of communication between students in Japan and native instructors in English medium classrooms in Japan. What I'm going to look at is turn-taking behavior in forms of address by students and to teachers. The first is an aspect that I've written about previously. The second one is new territory for me. As long as we're talking about forms of address, I might mention that my name was misspelled on the program. It should be an S-O-N rather than an S-E-N. My ancestors are Swedish, not Danish. Although I tell my relatives in Sweden that they can tell I'm a transplanted Swede because it only has one S, not two S's. There you go. Okay, so we'll start with turn taking here. And I can see already that I'm probably going to run out of time.
You're okay. You're okay.
Well, I've got a lot left. Okay, well, let's go before you come for me. Okay. So turn taking is something that I said I've written about before, particularly that there's a common pattern in Japan where most students remain silent even when the professor asks a specific question or tries to open the discussion. One more. In fact, to some extent, this is probably true throughout East Asia. Okay, students may be listening carefully but unwilling to speak out unless called on directly. And even then, they may be hesitant to answer. This pattern, where the allocation of turns is weighted heavily in the direction of the instructor, is sometimes explained in terms of the differences between speaker-centered mode of communication in North America and a listener-centered mode of characteristic of Japan. But as described, for example, by Haru Yamada, this style is characteristic not only of classrooms, but of interaction in the society more generally. Okay, so what happens in the classroom is a reflection of the more general society. Yamada also mentions how speaking rights tend to be granted lopsidedly to persons with the more powerful, usually senior roles, and so in this case, the teacher. Needless to say, this seemingly silent Japanese behavior is a frequent source of puzzlement to non-initiated inner circle instructors. Inner circle meaning, for example, America, UK, Australia, in Japanese classrooms. In some instances, it causes frustration and even anger. It is a gap that one would expect to have been narrowed somewhat through increased globalization, but in fact, this does not seem to be the case. Currently, I'm serving on a doctoral thesis committee at a major Japanese national university for a student who has been ethnographically researching the teaching of scientific English in Japanese university environments. One of the chapters is a case study of this very phenomenon, the frustrations of an American instructor trying to come to grips with this divergence of interactional norms in an English medium graduate classroom. This dissertation has not yet been officially completed, so I will avoid naming the author, but I suppose I can take the liberty of mentioning the title. The Sound of Silence. Oh, sorry, I don't have that one here. The Sound of Silence in a Chemistry Lecture. But it is not only foreign instructors who get caught up in this divergence of norms for interaction. It can happen with students as well, especially those who have lived abroad and experienced interaction patterns different from what they are used to in Japan. Often such students are among the one or two in a class who are not, or who are eager not to remain silent, but who offer to verbally discuss while their classmates seem content to let them share the floor with the lecturer. An incident from a few years ago made this very clear to me. One day, a student, whom I will call Kohei, approached me after class wanting to talk about the reverse culture shock that he had been experiencing. Kohei had just returned from a year of exchange study at an elite university in the US, where he had been enrolled in a business program. A major part of the course content consisted of discussing and negotiating solutions to business case studies. Kohei confided in me that he found himself in a dilemma upon returning to the Japanese university. On the one hand, he wanted to participate actively in my class as if it were an American classroom, and my being an American professor must have accentuated this. But on the other hand, he was wondering if by taking turns too often, he was somehow disregarding the norms of the Japanese classroom and being unfair to his classmates. Kohei and I also discussed this with a female student, I'll call her Yumi, who had returned recently from a year in Canada. Although Yumi indicated that she had also become used to actively participating in discussions while she was in Canada, upon returning to Japan, she was happy to sit and listen most of the time, speaking only when she felt the opportunity was clearly hers. So here we have a case of two different students, two styles, both aware of the cultural difference in classroom interaction style, both having apparently adopted a different style during their stay in North America, but one having more trouble than the other re-socializing into the Japanese mode. I'm going to leave this hanging there, and I'd now like to turn to the second aspect of interaction, namely forms of address. Assuming that I still have time. Seven, okay, well I might have to come to conclusions short. Okay. Forms of address, especially in situations where power is not shared among participants, such as student-teacher dyad, is an aspect of speaking that can differ widely across cultural contexts. Actually, I was made aware of the forms of address problem in Larry Smith's English as an International Language class way back in 1983. I remember an incident that occurred on the first day of the class after we had introduced ourselves. Larry told everyone to please call me Larry. But in the course of class, it came out that some of the Chinese and Japanese participants were uncomfortable with this, that they felt they would not be showing sufficient respect unless they referred to him as Professor Smith or at least Mr. Smith. Of course, Larry was flexible enough to accept either. If we consider American university environments in general, we might find the following gradations of acceptability in a way that students address instructors or professors. I should mention, however, that I have not investigated this empirically, nor do I know of anyone else who has. This is kind of impressionistic. In this scheme, T means title, LN is last name, FN is first name or given name. Number 1 is what I judge as being most acceptable, and 5 least acceptable. And the asterisk means I don't think it would be acceptable to refer to the teacher in those that way. I'm going to kind of skip over that. You can quickly glance at that. The above would not apply to all Western cultures, however. I guess I'll cut the conclusion. For example, in Swedish universities, where I worked for 2 years, FN alone, first name alone, would be the clear favorite in nearly all situations. In fact, I have a Swedish colleague who informally surveyed students about the preferred ways of referring to instructors. And almost universally, they judge first name to be the most acceptable, seeing other options as overly formal or distant. Now, if we were to describe Japanese forms of student and teacher address, we would come up with something like the following. And this assumes Japanese language interaction between Japanese students and a Japanese professor. For this illustration, I'll call the professor Nobuyuki Hino, who is in the back of the room.
Thank you.
Does not look right, but this is how I would view the situation in Japan. Most acceptable is just sensei or sensei plus family name. And then sensei plus first name would be, I'd say, kind of iffy. And the last two completely out of the ballpark. So in Japan, the norms for addressing professors seem to be fairly clear compared with the US, where there's sometimes uncertainty about whether an instructor should be referred to by last name or first name with title. But when Japanese students in Japan have a Western teacher, the norms tend to get muddled in peculiar ways. In my experience in Japan, which now totals about 30 years, I often encounter situations where either the teacher side or the student side feels uncomfortable because of the forms of address used. I'm going to skip the first example and go down to the second one, which is an interesting one from my colleague. The surname of my colleague, Mary Noguchi, is Noguchi only because of her marriage affiliation. Yet students seem resistant to using her surname, Noguchi, most likely because she, like me, is of Northern European stock, and therefore about as foreign as one can be from Japanese eyes. Students hence tend to refer to her as Mary Sensei, or simply Mary, despite the fact that she often corrects them, pointing out explicitly that in Japan, it is the norm to refer to one's professor with a title plus last name. I think she feels, and I feel as well, that this kind of undermines your authority as a teacher and kind of puts you more in the position of a conversation partner, which is what some students come to expect from foreign entertainers on TV, and young teachers close to their own age who work in the private language schools. Okay. Anyway, somehow Professor Noguchi's explanation to her students does not seem to stick, and she can't quite get away from being Mary Sensei. Okay, I have a conclusion, but I guess if
You can conclude.
I can conclude,
Don't leave me hanging.
okay. So, what is the solution to this? Well, there is no good solution, but we have some things which I think help us understand this better. This is a quotation, obviously. We predicted the increasing numbers of non-native speakers in Asia and the world will mean that native speakers will need to make the accommodation to nativized varieties of English. We therefore propose the following simple code of conduct, that speakers of variety X must accommodate the speakers of variety Y when in the cultural domains of variety of Y speakers and vice versa. When in neutral domains, speakers must accommodate to each other. Okay. Another quote here, intercultural competence is the ability to see the relationships between different cultures, both internal and external to a society, and to mediate, that is, to interpret in terms of the other, either for themselves or for other people. Okay, now there's a problem, just going back for a minute, if I've got one more minute.
Okay, but I'll stand up in 30 seconds.
Okay. Problem with this thing about accommodating to Y, if you're in a classroom where the students, the wider society is one culture and the teacher's society is a different culture, which culture are you in? I think this is a common dilemma that we're all confronted with in Japan and other similar countries. So do you follow the teacher's norms or do you follow the student's norms? And I would argue that this is kind of neutral territory, that both have to accommodate somewhat to each other.
I'm coming for you, friend.
Literacy, communication, English as an international language is not something to be learned only by non-native speakers of English, but by native speakers as well.
Very good.